right, hello everybody. Welcome. And by everybody, I'm talking about the small but eager crowd in the moot courtroom and the much larger crowd that's out there virtually. And hopefully, the virtual crowd will be jumping in with questions that they can email us so that our speaker today can answer them and interact with you. Well, I'm Michael Scharf. I'm the co-dean of the law school, and it is my distinct pleasure to introduce today's distinguished speaker, David Abbott. Having recently retired as president of the George Gunn Foundation in December, David has stepped into a new role in 2022 as the inaugural Distinguished Jurist in Residence at Case Western Reserve University School of Law. David boasts a storied career. He earned his law degree at Harvard University and a master's degree at Columbia University. Before joining the Gunn Foundation in 2003, David served as president of University Circle Incorporated, executive director of the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame, and executive director of the Cleveland Bicentennial Commission. Early in his career, David worked as a reporter for the Cleveland Plain Dealer. Last September, the law school jointly awarded David and his equally impressive wife, Jan Roller, the Cox International Law Center's annual Humanitarian of the Year Award. Today, David will be sharing his wisdom with us on the issue of regionalization, or regionalism, I should say, and the role it could play in the future of the Cleveland metropolitan area. Today's event is being webcast, as I mentioned, and we are very pleased to have our small but excited audience here and our much larger audience in the internet. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming David Abbott.
Thank you, Michael. That is enthusiastic for this small but mighty crowd in the moot courtroom, and I do hope that those of you out there in the Ethernet are able to listen and join in. And I'm happy to be here talking about this rather murky topic of regionalism, a topic I've spoken on before, and every time it happens, I always wonder, how did I get into this? Why am I doing this? Recently, I went to a speech where Mayor Justin Bibb, Cleveland's new mayor, was making a presentation, and at the end there was an opportunity for questions, and I thought, well, I'll ask him a question thinking of this event. And so I said, Mayor, what does regionalism mean to you? And his response at first was, well, you're the expert on regionalism. And I thought, how did this happen? I'm a very city of Cleveland-centric guy. I live in the city. I've always worked in the city. Even when I worked for Cuyahoga County, I was focused mostly on the city of Cleveland. It's the county seat. It's where most of the work of the county government is done. And I've always had that orientation, yet somehow I have become connected with the idea of the greater region of Northeast Ohio and greater Cleveland, whatever that might mean. And when I wonder how did I get this reputation, it made me think of when I retired at the end of December. I had been involved in an organization called the Fund for Economic Future, a collaboration of funders that I helped start and then was very active in for my entire time at the Gunn Foundation. And when I retired at the end of the year, they gave me a set of whiskey glasses as a going away present, each one engraved with a different slogan. And this one says, general lover of focusing on the hard stuff. Now, I know there was a double meaning there, you know, the hard stuff that I would have in here, but also the hard issues that the foundations need to be working on, including the idea of regionalism and the regional economy. But it is a tough issue. It's also a tough word. I mean, you said regionalization, regionalism. I've always thought the word regionalism sounds like a disease. And I've never really liked it for that reason, but also because it's so hard to define, and it's even harder to apply in the real world when you think about how regionalism ought to be executed in our lives. What does it mean? How does one do that? And so as I thought about how I might define it for the value of this audience, I, of course, turned to the United States Supreme Court and Justice Potter Stewart's definition. Famously remembered the last phrase, I know it when I see it. Now, he didn't actually, of course, write that about regionalism, but I decided to cheat a little and stick it in there because although he was talking about hardcore pornography, I thought it's just as hard to define regionalism, and maybe even harder, because I'm not sure when we see what's called regionalism out there in Northeast Ohio and in our communities that we would recognize it as such. I don't know that we do know it when we see it. That's the kind of word that it is, that's the kind of concept it is, but let's talk about it anyway. Let's figure out whether or not when we are talking about it tonight, you see regionalism. So let's start with this. Here's a map of Cuyahoga County. And you see Cleveland, the city of Cleveland, in gray there in the center. And many people, when they think about regionalism, think about this geography. They think that it applies to Cuyahoga County. And in fact, many of the efforts over the last century or more that have been called regionalism have been directed at this piece of geography. All 59 communities making up Cuyahoga County have sometimes been lumped under the phrase of Greater Cleveland or the name Our Region. And there were, in the 20th century, 6 different efforts to address regional government in Northeast Ohio by merging the communities in Northeast Ohio into one county, or putting them under one county. They all failed. But that was what was thought of as regional government or regionalization. And we have Cleveland sitting in the center of this county, representing today only about 29% of the population of Cuyahoga County, whereas it used to be about 80% of the county, and originally 100% of the county. It's only about 18% of the area of Cuyahoga County. A little larger, of course, percentage of the population. And there are about 1.3 million living in the county. But Cleveland, as you probably know, gets the label of being the poorest city in America because it is confined to the geography and surrounded by these other communities, and much of the wealth that historically may have been developed in Cleveland has moved out to the suburbs, leaving Cleveland as a, relatively speaking, poor community. And I want to just digress for a second and look at Franklin County, where the city of Columbus and our state capital is. Here you see the orange territory as the city of Columbus. And even though the population of Franklin and Cuyahoga counties are about the same, Columbus represents about 42% of the area compared to 18% for Cleveland, and 68% of that county's population, whereas Cleveland is only 29%. And so that gives you a sense of why these comparisons don't make a lot of sense. I just want to mention that because it gets brought up so often that it's apples to oranges all the time when you compare city geographies, because they all have their own histories, their own political histories that led to the formation of the city and the drawing of the city boundaries where they are. In the case of Columbus, a mayor in the 1950s really pursued annexation aggressively, using the city's water system as a way of requiring suburban territory or unincorporated territory to become part of the city of Columbus. Cleveland had that opportunity too and did use it to some extent back around 1900 and in that era, but it decided to switch gears and viewed their water system as a commodity to sell to the suburbs, as a revenue source. And so it entered into these relationships that are no longer possible to break, really. And the city of Cleveland was stuck with the boundaries that it has now. Of course, at the time, that didn't seem like an unwise proposition because the city wasn't fully built out, and neither were all of these other communities, and so it didn't seem necessary. Who could foresee what would happen when interstate highways came along and all of the outmigration that made possible? Columbus had the advantage of developing much later, and so they took advantage of their ability to use the water system for that purpose. So that's just one point of comparison, just because we often think about, well, gee, why is Cleveland confined the way it is, and couldn't we just grow that way? That battle has been lost. Here's another way of looking at our region, though. These are the 5 counties of what is avowedly a regional organization, the Northeast Ohio Area-Wide Coordinating Agency, which is charged by the federal government with distributing federal transportation dollars. And so they have some authority in a very limited way in these 5 counties. It's a very important organization, and they didn't decide on these 5 counties as the region. That was decided by the federal government and by the politics that went into deciding where the boundary would be. But here's another way of looking at Northeast Ohio. This was adopted as the footprint of an organization called the Northeast Ohio Sustainable Communities Consortium for the purposes of doing what was primarily a land use assessment and planning exercise and visioning process for Northeast Ohio, looking at what has happened to our region over time as people have moved out and the impact that it has had on us. And I'll come back to that in a little bit. And here's finally another one, and these are not the only ones, but this is an 18-county footprint of Northeast Ohio that is thought of as the effective region by the Fund for Our Economic Future and also an organization called Team NEO, which is a business philanthropy partnership focused on the regional economy. So this market, if you will, this is really a market map, is about the 15th largest market in the United States, and it's got about 4 million people living in it. And it really was latched onto by the organizations I mentioned because of an assessment of where the labor market was. There's no hard boundary to that. And so the boundary is kind of deceptive when you see that when the political boundaries are used to define something that is admittedly as amorphous as a region. But that's kind of what we're stuck with doing. And this is what the organizations I mentioned are using. And so there's representatives from all of those counties that come together and try to plan for the present and the future. That gives you a sense, just in one way, of how complicated regionalism can be, because it's hard to define even the region that you're talking about. The word region isn't even clear. And frankly, for different issues, it has different meanings. If you wanted to talk about the Great Lakes region, obviously it would be a much bigger piece of geography. If you want to talk about sharing fire service in some piece of geography, that's going to be much smaller. Those are real issues, but it just goes to make the point that regions are amorphous. They will be flexible, they will change, they'll grow or shrink depending on the issue or issues at hand. That's one of the complications of talking about regions, that they're so hard to define and make it just very complicated to engage in. But what drives this discussion? Why do we talk about it? Why do we keep having this conversation? There are really many issues that come up. One is a set of environmental issues. Water quality, air quality, for instance, certainly do not confine themselves to any political boundary. They are going to spread far and wide potentially, and so if they're going to be addressed, regional solutions may be the best way to do it. Equity concerns are another one, where you have great disparities among the various communities. This only shows the counties, but there are hundreds of municipalities in Northeast Ohio and other special purpose governments like port authorities and sewer districts and school districts. And they have widely varying resource and revenue streams. They have widely varying abilities to deal with the populations that they serve. And of course, the communities themselves and the populations in them vary in their needs. So there are tremendous equity issues that raise the consideration of the region. Cost is another one. We spend a lot of money. I don't know what happened there to the map. We spend a lot of money for the privilege of having so many governments in Northeast Ohio. A study that was done by the Fund for Economic Future a few years ago showed that it's almost $1,000 a person in Northeast Ohio compared to Franklin County, which has far fewer governmental jurisdictions. This is how much we pay for having all of this local government. So that's a big cost. And then when you're running a community and you're looking at the cost of providing a service, the need to economize, which is always present, but in times of tough economies or when the political mood is in a certain direction, it becomes even more important. And that makes for consideration of how you might economize by trying to get some economy of scale on a regional basis. Efficiency is a related notion, but not quite the same, that you can do a more efficient job of providing service if you're at a scale which is going to allow you to be more responsive more quickly. and similarly providing just higher quality services. Wow, this thing is super sensitive. Higher quality services to people by doing it on a regional at scale basis instead of doing it in a little suburb or in a single county. And so that often drives the discussion. And then another big one is economic competitiveness. And this is increasingly a motivation for the regional conversation, because it's clear now, it was not so clear many years ago, that it's really regions that are the effective geographical unit of the economy. It's not counties, it's not cities, not even states. And even the nation is really a network of regional economies. So that these are some, but not all of the motivations behind the regional conversation. And it leads us in many directions. But it's clear that these do not confine themselves to any particular piece of geography. And so what happens is that people then start coming up with ideas to give regionalism meaning. The most common one, the one that people often think of as regionalism, is government consolidation. In some places, like in Indianapolis, where they have combined almost the entire county into one government, unigov as they call it, people think, why can't we do that in Cleveland? Or how might we do that? How might we combine some of the suburbs? And I'll talk about that a little more. As I mentioned, in the 20th century, there were 6 different efforts to combine the county and the municipal governments in Cuyahoga County under a county charter that under the Ohio Constitution would allow for municipal functions to become functions of the county. But if you try to do that, you have to have an election with 4 different majorities by the vote. One, a majority vote by the entire county, a majority vote by the largest city, a majority vote by the people outside the largest city but in the county, and a majority of all the separate municipalities in the county. So that is a tall order, never been accomplished. They came close in the 1930s, but they didn't get the suburban vote. And so it failed and is likely never to come up again. What happened in Cuyahoga County a few years ago, which I'll come back to, is not that kind of charter. So that's one big way that people talk about regionalization or regionalism. Another one is government reform, changing the system, structure, organization of government to try to make it more effective. Public service consolidation or sharing, lots of examples of that. There could be government collaboration that is actually forced upon the government. I'll talk about an example of that. Then there are voluntary approaches to government collaboration. And then there's a lot of work by civic and public-private partnerships to advance regionalism, some of which have had pretty significant effect. Let me just talk about government consolidation in a couple of specific examples and talk about why it's so hard. The case of East Cleveland, just a few blocks from where we are here in University Circle. East Cleveland has about 13,000 residents and is pretty small. It's only about 3 square miles. It's one of the most impoverished cities in the United States. And the mayor, about a decade ago, realized that his only real chance for getting out of the fiscal emergency that they have long been in under state supervision of sorts was to merge with the city of Cleveland. And so he raised the issue of how this could happen. How could we get the city of Cleveland and the city of East Cleveland to merge and make it just a little larger Cleveland? This cost him his job. He was recalled by the citizens of East Cleveland, and so was the city council president. And it had not even advanced to the point of the city of Cleveland saying that, oh, sure, we're willing to do it. There wasn't a commitment on the city of Cleveland's part either because of the poverty in East Cleveland and the needs. If you go through there, you'll see that they have a tremendous problem just filling the potholes. So that never came to a vote, but it was clear that the political winds were not in favor of it. And that is for an extremely distressed small piece of geography where it couldn't get off the ground. Not too far away, 4 suburbs on the east side of Cleveland, shown here in this slightly fuzzy map: Pepper Pike, Woodmere, Moreland Hills, and Orange Village. entered into discussions to merge into one community. They already share some services. They're all part of they have a single school district, and it just seemed to make an awful lot of sense that they would do this and potentially set an example for others. The Plain Dealer called it the most significant step toward regionalism in Cleveland's history. Now, I think that was a wild overstatement, especially given the fact that it died. They entered into a lot of conversations, but they could not come to an agreement on how to make it happen. So if you've got two little issues like this, how could you possibly do it on a larger geography like Cuyahoga County or the city of Cleveland along with some other suburbs? And there are lots of reasons why it is so difficult. The fact is that you have to get the voters' approval on both sides of the map, both in the community that is doing the absorption, if you will, and the other that is being annexed, or the merger partners all have to separately approve it. And that's really tough when you have built-in most cases, opposition in the form of elected office holders who would see their jobs at risk and their ability to appoint other people to jobs at risk. That's always a big obstacle, very hard to overcome. There is also a kind of misplaced satisfaction, perhaps in the case of these communities, that things are fine out here. You know, we don't need to do anything. And that's a short-sighted view even for the wealthiest communities, and I'll come back to that in a little bit because of the nature of our regional economy. I think you have to recognize that we're so used to a map that has so many little boxes of government in which, and we all live in one of them, that it confines our thinking and our ability to realize that the problems we face do engage us, even if they seem to be more concentrated over there, or if the problem is something that you left and you think you got away from it. That little box thinking is a real problem, and I think it infects all of these conversations. A big impediment is Ohio's home rule provisions in the Ohio Constitution that gives municipalities largely independent lawmaking authority. The state legislatures eroded that in some ways in the not so recent past, or in the recent past, but it's still the prevailing legal framework, and that really inhibits somebody else trying to influence this conversation because the communities themselves have the veto power. There is no ability of the state to come in and say, you know, we really need to regionalize for the benefit of everybody, and so here's how we're going to do it. That can't happen. And I don't think you can overlook in any conversation, especially in the one in East Cleveland, and in one that would be countywide, the role of race and the role that our history of racism in this country plays in both the way laws were written and implemented in terms of housing policy and a variety of government benefits and employment, so that when African Americans finally acquired political power by virtue of numbers in a place like Cleveland, when they hear talk of regionalism, they often equate it with, these are the white suburbanites who left Cleveland now trying to come back and re-seize power and take it away from us. And that's perfectly understandable and is a tremendously difficult obstacle to overcome when you think about government consolidation. And it may not, in fact, be something that can be overcome. And if you look across the country at places that have voted to consolidate, it is almost entirely in homogeneous places, not diverse places like Northeast Ohio. And the race issue doesn't just apply that way. There are plenty of people in our communities, as we know, who feel that they left Black people behind and the problems they associated with them. And they don't want them back. And they don't want to be reunited with them. And so the race problem is a huge one in any discussion of regionalism, as it is in so many things in our country and in our history. So that's just the notion of government consolidation, which is often, as I said, what people think regionalism is. But there are also efforts at government reform, just reorganizing things and seeing if that's a better way of doing things. In Cuyahoga County, we reformed the government about 12 years ago, taking it from 11 separate administrative office holders down to an executive and a county council. And I certainly was in favor of that. I worked for 10 years in Cuyahoga County government, and I knew what a screwy form of government the old way was, and I believe this one is better. But is this regionalism? That's a debatable proposition. I think it certainly advances various regional activity by giving the county, in the form of a single executive, a more coherent approach to any conversation, and therefore including in regional conversations, there is a voice that is more coherent representing the whole county. But that's largely it. There are a variety of things that the county does that one might also consider regionalism, but they've been doing that under the old form too. So it's an important question to think about when we talk about reforming government, whether this is something that we would see as regionalism. But we also should remember that this only happened in Cuyahoga County because of a crisis, because of a big scandal involving some of the elected office holders. And that's why the voters rose up and adopted a charter which didn't take any municipal powers away from the communities in our county, but just reorganized the existing powers of the county. But it took that kind of crisis, and it would probably take something similar to get some other big ballot issue approved going forward. Then there are a lot of opportunities and a lot of examples of public service sharing or consolidation. The county has a somewhat consolidated 911 dispatch system. They're working to make it even more consolidated, represent more of the county, but it's something that's been going on for quite a while. And there are some examples of shared fire and police service in Cuyahoga County, some more formal than others, where they serve multiple jurisdictions. And in other cases, it's just a question of reciprocity, and if you need us, we'll help you, and you'll help us when we need it. There's quite a few examples of that. Schools are another possibility. We have tons of school districts in our county in Northeast Ohio and throughout Ohio. Do we really need them all? Well, that's a real hot button issue and a third rail for many folks when you talk about regionalism, whether you would consolidate school districts. But there are consolidated school districts in our county already. I mentioned the 4 communities that talked about merger. They already share a single school district, and there are others as well. So maybe that's one that could be advanced farther down the road. Then there are a lot of social services that the county, and this is the Alcohol and Drug Addiction Mental Health Services Board, that gets money from both the state and Cuyahoga County and distributes them to service providers who are largely nonprofit organizations. And there are lots of other examples like that where there is a kind of consolidated approach to providing service. It isn't done on a municipal basis. It's another big topic and area for examination if anybody wants to go down that path, if that's something that moves you. There have been examples of people who have gotten so distressed by the way government was providing service that they filed lawsuits about it to try to change things. And there are examples of when that has led to forced government collaboration, such as the creation 50 years ago by the Court of Common Pleas of the Northeast Ohio Regional Sewer District as a result of a couple of lawsuits. One by the state against the city of Cleveland that was then providing the service because of the terrible job they were doing and the impact that was having on waterways. It was a contributor to the famous fire in 1969 on the Cuyahoga River. And then there were some of the suburban communities who were suing over the way rates were being set. All of this eventually led to a court order in 1972 to form a regional sewer district that has appointments from both the city and the suburbs and the county to the governing board. And so it provides a very important service, and it gets very high marks for the quality of the work that it does, and is making a big contribution to the improvement of water quality in Northeast Ohio. So it's a big success story, but it came about because somebody filed a lawsuit. A case of voluntary government collaboration, largely voluntary, is the Regional Transit Authority, where the city had the transit system, and it was being under tremendous financial distress in the 1960s. And there was certainly an effort by the county and the city to get them to improve it and to change the way they did their business. But there was not a lawsuit filed. It was simply a political negotiating process among the city, the county, and the suburbs that led to the formation of RTA. And it continues to this day, as we know. So anyone seeking change in the field of government operations wants to see consolidation or other improvements. There are certainly ways to go about it other than just through the direct political process. You can file a lawsuit if you think you have a cause of action that's worthwhile. There could be some creative work applied to the Ohio Constitution. It's had many things attached to it over the years, and maybe someone could find a way to persuade the voters to change the way in which consolidations occur. Maybe someone could even imagine a way to get voters to create actual regions that are actual governmental units as part of the Constitution. Is not the case today, but it's a really heavy lift. Changing political boundaries is an extremely difficult and challenging thing. Just look at the fight going on over redistricting right now and how difficult that is. And that's, obviously an entirely political fight, but the motivations that are behind that would apply in any discussion of changing the way we do it in the rest of the state on an ongoing basis. So let me shift gears a little to another motivation for the way we approach regionalism, and that's the motivation that comes from a recognition of how our regional economy is doing. And that is what's led to the formation of a number of organizations, and I'm going to go through just a couple of them quickly, not all of them, that have had key roles in helping us think about how we approach our ability to compete in the rural economy. And they include the Greater Cleveland Partnership, which is Greater Cleveland's Chamber of Commerce. The Fund for Economic Future I mentioned, which is a collaboration of funders. The organization known as Team NEO, which is a business philanthropy partnership focused on the regional economy, and the Northeast Ohio Sustainable Communities Consortium. Each of these has taken a different approach, but each contributes to an assessment of how we as a region are doing, because that's how the business marketplace exists and is vital to anything else that we really care about in Northeast Ohio. So let me quickly run through some of the work that they have done or are doing. The Greater Cleveland Partnership is leading an effort called the Cleveland Innovation Project, which is focused on key areas of regional advantage in our economy and how we can use it to really focus on accelerating new startups and growth of companies already here. And those areas are advanced manufacturing, the healthcare field, and water technologies, recognizing that each of these has something unique in Northeast Ohio and in Cleveland that we can take advantage of if we focus resources on it rather than trying to spread resources all over every business sector. And that's where the Innovation Project is trying to make its mark. The Northeast Ohio Sustainable Communities Consortium, which is really not an active organization at the moment, was formed with the benefit of a great HUD grant about 10 years ago and some money from local philanthropy to do an assessment largely focused on land use in Northeast Ohio and how that is affecting our ability to compete. And it's a startling set of data that they discovered, and also recommendations that they made that are worth you looking at. All of this is available online. But as I said, it took largely a land use study and assessed how, as we have sprawled out, how we have used land and what that has cost us. And over the last 50 years, we've doubled the amount of developed land in Northeast Ohio with almost the same population. And the consequence of that is that we're paying a much higher tax bill for all the infrastructure that goes with developing land. That's everything from streets and sewers to water lines and schools and police and all of that. But we still have to pay for what we left behind, what is still in Cleveland or in other older communities. So our taxes have gone up tremendously because of that. We've consumed a lot more green space. We've required us to spend more time in our cars commuting, which has environmental and other consequences as well. And as a consequence, to a fair degree, made this region less attractive, especially to younger people who want to have a more dense, vibrant urban environment. And that's the kind of talent we need to be attracting for the economy of the future. And all of that was fueled in part by that kind of little box map, which we saw at the beginning that we live in every day in Cuyahoga County and beyond, because each one of those little boxes has a government which is trying to do its job, including what's maybe called economic development, and may only be getting a company to move from my neighboring community into my community. So it's a loss for the first community and a gain for the second, but it's no gain for the rest of us because it's not adding to our regional economy at all. And a lot of that goes on. And then also, land use policies, laws governing that, home rule, transportation dollars, tax laws, all these things have contributed to this out-migration. And what Vibrant Northeast Ohio 2040 tries to do is get us to stop and take a look at it and make an assessment of is this the kind of future we want for us? And is it a competitive future? I don't think the answer is yes. And it makes a lot of recommendations about legislation around allocating infrastructure money to fix old infrastructure before you build new, for how you allocate transportation dollars, more money for transit and things like that. So there's a set of recommendations in this very important piece of work. The problem with it is there's really no quarterback out there now running with this ball. There is no political actor. There is no regional president or CEO who can do it. The other organizations I mentioned and will mention are trying to advance it still, but it doesn't have a home except at NOACA, the Transportation Planning Organization at the moment. So it needs to get a greater champion. The Fund for Our Economic Future came out a couple of years ago with a report called The Two Tomorrows, which we use as a way to frame our approach to competitiveness in Northeast Ohio. I'm still saying "our" because I've only been retired a couple of months, so I think I have a year to be able to do that. The fund actually started as a response to a recognition that the regional economy was in the doldrums. And you may recall the Quiet Crisis series that the Plain Dealer and IdeaStream did now about 20 years ago or more. And that's what catalyzed philanthropy to say, what can we do? How can we enter this and make a contribution? Because it's not terrain that philanthropy was used to. We're used to giving to the arts or education or human services. But we felt it was essential to all of those and other fields we fund to really approach the regional economy seriously. And so the fund frames it as a companion set of goals around growth and opportunity, that we need to grow business and grow jobs, but we need to make sure that there's equitable access to those jobs, because that is what is going to really ensure our ability to thrive going forward. Because if we don't, we won't have the workforce we need to fuel business, and we won't be able to avoid an ever-increasing social service cost of people who are left out of the economy. And it highlights the role that systemic racial exclusion played over decades to lead us to the situation where we have so much inequity in our communities and in our society, and that we need to call that out as we plan for the future and make funding decisions, and as businesses make location decisions and hiring decisions. How we do all those things affect our ability to really thrive going forward by including everybody. And then finally, Team NEO, which is this organization of various sectors that was originally just a business attraction organization. But the state of Ohio did something important when Governor Kasich was in office, and that was to divide the state up into regions when he created Jobs Ohio, this quasi-state organization that's a nonprofit technically, and gets the state liquor profits tax to invest in economic growth. And they wanted to do it on a regional basis, not on a county by county basis or city by city basis. And so Team NEO was ready to step into that role. And so they were anointed by the state as the Jobs Ohio partner, and it works in collaboration with the chambers of commerce and governments and companies in the region as a whole by providing marketing and business attraction services and research and a variety of services to help companies locate and grow here. In many ways, it's still a startup, even though it's been going now for about 10 years, but it's still really just now, I think, hitting its stride and doing the job that we need it to do. And one of the great things about it, in my opinion, is its name, because it expresses the way we all need to think about our region and what regionalism is. Because to me, the most compelling way to think about regionalism is as us as a team, all of us in Northeast Ohio as a team, because all these other efforts are either impossibly hard or not all that impactful. And what we really need to be focused on is the fact that it's regions competing against the rest of the world. And so we all, in order to do that, all need to think about ourselves as part of that team that's in competition. And that's a reality that's imposed on us. This isn't a choice. Regionalism is not a choice. It is. It exists. We're doing it now. Whether we're doing it well or great is a debate, but we always need to be doing it, and we need to be thinking of ways to do it more effectively. And that means all of us. And we're largely on our own in this process. The dysfunction at the federal government level, frequent dysfunction at the state level, means regions can act. They can, if we get our act together, actually act in this global arena. And we need to be doing it. And it forces us to recognize that no individual community, no little box, is master of its own destiny. It's only by coordinating, by pulling together, that we're going to have the kind of economy and future that we need going forward. And that does not mean that every place in Northeast Ohio is equal. As you think about a team, there are some players who are going to be more important, some positions that are going to be more important than others. And that makes Cleveland more important than really any other place in Northeast Ohio, although there are other important urban centers in Northeast Ohio too. And places like University Circle are tremendously important because of the intellectual capital and the job creation possibilities and reality that is coming out of University Circle. So it makes urban places more important, both because of the centers of intellectual and resource capital that they create, but also because they are attractive to the kind of talent we need to attract. And it also creates a lot of the efficiency and cost saving and service provision goals that we want to see accomplished in some of the other forms of regionalization or regionalism. It seems to me that Cleveland should be actually leading the regional drive, not fearing it, not thinking it's some sort of effort or conspiracy to take away power from the city, but really as a way to put the city in the lead of a much bigger choir. And I hope that's with the new administration, the kind of approach that we will see being taken, because that is really important to all of us in Northeast Ohio. And to me, that's, as I said, the essence of regionalism, this notion that we're all in competition and it's the team that we're on that is what's important. Everything else is just a play in the playbook, and we'll decide which plays we want to run. I don't know that there's ever any likelihood we will actually be united in some governmental sense, but we certainly have to find ways to act more united, to unify in ways that enable us to compete more effectively. And now I'm happy to answer questions.
We have questions coming in there, or shall I launch one? You can launch. Okay. And I'll take the microphone so they can hear me out in the audience. Well, thank you. That was a wonderful tour to horizon of this entire very complicated issue, but very timely and very important.
Hard stuff.
You said, David, that sometimes it takes a crisis to get things to change. What kinds of crises might get the city of Cleveland and the region to embrace some of these regionalism ideas that you were talking about?
Well, I'm not entirely sure. One never knows what the reaction to a crisis will be. Just as the county corruption crisis came up, I don't think it would have led to the outcome that it had not the plain dealer made a crusade of it. And they really did. I mean, they hammered it every day, and it woke a lot of people up. I think the response, reforming county government, did not solve corruption. There's always the possibility of that in any form of government, but it did a lot of good things that needed to be done in terms of the efficiency and effectiveness of the government. That's not the basis on which people understood it or voted, however. So the future crisis may need to be misrepresented in some way in order to have a good outcome, for one thing, who knows. But it could be something like some terrible economic crisis, I guess, if people didn't think the quiet crisis was that sort of crisis, then I don't know if a louder one would have that effect. I'm not quite sure what it would be, because it probably wouldn't affect just Northeast Ohio. But maybe it would be an environmental crisis, like a real catastrophe in Lake Erie, where people recognize we've got to do something to act.
What about a bond default? That would be a bond default?
Oh, a bond default, possibly. I mean, as the city of Cleveland had in 1979, and which led to the, or 78, which led to the defeat of Dennis Kucinich and a new administration, and a couple of tax issues. So, yeah, maybe something like that. But that might be too esoteric for most people. I don't know.
Can creditors force regionalization?
That's an interesting. I mean, there are no regional bonds out there. There are, or at least, well, there probably are some sewer district bonds, so they're regional in a partial way. But I think they're well secured by the rates that we all pay for our sewer service. So I don't know if there's a regional bond that would force creditors to do it.
Your most recent, or a recent default, of course, is Detroit. So I guess the question is, when Detroit filed for bankruptcy, what impact did that have on Wayne County? I think that's where Detroit is located, and the larger southeastern Michigan region, in terms of bringing to bear resources to make sure that doesn't happen again and to consolidate the leadership for greater growth.
Yeah, I don't think it led to any change in the governmental structure in Detroit or Wayne County. Right. It led to the election of a new mayor, but not of any change in the political governmental landscape that I know of. So it does take, I think, people just don't pay attention for the most part. We live in our little boxes, and so we don't see the big picture. It is a complicated, hard to describe, hard to explain topic, and I think it would take something that would really penetrate that and get people to realize, oh, we should vote. But in the meantime, we have all this other work that we can do.
What about loss of a sports team?
Well,
that's got a higher profile.
That does have a higher profile, and that happened too.
Yes.
But it didn't lead to anything to change a regional structure, maybe because Mayor White at the time led the crusade to keep the Browns, or get them back. So I don't know. That's hard to say. I have a couple of questions that Eric has handed me. How should U.S. congressional districts factor into any regionalized map, recognizing that Cleveland metro area lost a congressional district at its westernmost district out to Toledo? Well, that's a tough one because the congressional districts just sort of lay on top of our regular governmental districts, and they don't serve purposes of service provision except through the congressional offices and how they represent us in Washington. So whether the new districts are the same or not, and they're not going to be the same because we have lost one, then those are just laid on top of the existing structure. It makes the job different for the person in the office because now he or she is thinking about this community over here instead of that community over there, and not just in terms of what services they need, but how do I get the votes from them? And as we know, and as the Supreme Court has now said 4 times, the process that has led to the maps as they exist thus far has been politicized to an unconstitutional extent, so that the maps don't even fairly represent the will of the people expressed in the vote several years ago to require a fairer process of creating districts. But that's not what's going on. So whether we'll have congressional districts in place for sure this year, we're going to vote on them soon, but who knows if that will be sustained or changed, and if they are, whether they'll last very long. Under the process that was approved, they have to be changed again in 4 years anyway. So that's a whole other very complicated and highly politicized process, but it does illustrate how hard it is to change boundaries of almost anything. People feel like these were handed down on stone tablets from Mount Sinai, and instead of the decisions of a different set of politicians a number of years ago. So I think the congressional districts will be whatever they're going to be, and they really won't play much of a role in a regionalized map. Another question here is, can you speak more about how regionalism could impact public education in greater Cleveland and Northeast Ohio? Well, that's a big topic. I think that the inequity in the way that we fund public education is an issue that's been recognized repeatedly also by the Ohio Supreme Court, but there has not been a constitutional solution presented by the legislature thus far, even though that the Supreme Court has essentially given up on it. But that was, gosh, how long ago? 20 years ago, probably. That was the last time the Supreme Court ruled on it. And that it doesn't hold prospects for our ability as a state or as a region to respond to this inequity very well, because the taxing system is very complicated. You have counties and municipalities and school districts that all have different types of taxing authority. So that gets into all sorts of politics as well as just the legal authority. But then a school district deciding, can we afford to ask the voters for X, knowing that they've turned it down before, that we don't have a very strong tax base. One community may have an entirely residential tax base, whereas another community will have more commercial and industrial tax base, which gives it a huge advantage. Those inequities are so entrenched and have been around so long, I'm not optimistic about our willingness or ability to change them. I mean, I think we could do it, but I don't think there is the political will to do it, because it always feels like somebody's being robbed in order to help somebody else. Needn't be that way, I don't think, but if we value equity in education, and maybe at the end of the day, as a state, we simply don't value it sufficiently, then there won't be much change. If you could change it, then I think you could see an awful lot of creativity applied to education in Northeast Ohio. I mean, there's a need for that everywhere anyway, because for the most part, we're still educating kids the way they were educated 150 years ago. And we need to be a lot more smart, a lot more creative in thinking about how we educate children for the economy of the future. And thinking regionally could benefit that, because you wouldn't need to duplicate every approach everywhere in every school district. You could creatively imagine different approaches, especially now that we're more used to online learning, where you could combine some of that with these processes. And so districts that have advantages of a museum in their community, or a science center, or a factory, or a business that's willing to open its doors to children in a creative way. I mean, there's lots of creativity that could be applied, and that could be accomplished far more effectively on a regional basis than it could be on every single school district. So that's it.
David, you mentioned the orange.
I'm getting a high sign from Eric back here, but
Do we have to end? Okay, I'll ask one last question. So, you mentioned the orange school system that is a regional school system for those 4 suburbs. And my son went to that school system, and it was great. He had great education. It's one of the top school systems in the state. What went wrong when the 4 suburbs mayors started to talk about consolidating their police stations, their fire stations, their garbage pickup? Where did that get unhinged?
well, they did it all in private, so I don't know for sure, but from what I understand, it was that very fact that when you have that kind of conversation, that becomes threatening for the people who are policemen, firemen, police chiefs, in various jobs, even mayors. You realize that, gosh, if we combine, some of us are not going to be here anymore. And even if you're the mayor of a very small community, you know, that's a feather in your cap. And you feel like, gosh, it's a rare politician who wants to give that up. I credit Gary Norton, the mayor of East Cleveland, with running the risks that he ran to broach the topic of merging with the city of Cleveland. And it cost him his job. But, and that sends a lesson then to others who might go down that path as well. But that's where it gets very difficult, where people realize, and until they, you know, this crisis, it might, on a very small scale like that, those 4 communities, it might simply be, we can't afford to do this anymore. Our voters aren't going to approve taxes to pay for 4 different fire chiefs and 4 different, and equipment and all of it goes with it, and 4 different police departments, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, I think if the newspaper really did a great article about how expensive and needless it is to have that kind of duplication, it might get people thinking.
Well, the Plain Dealer actually has done a lot of stories like that over the years. Periodically, they raise this issue and they'll do a bunch of stories, and it seems not to have much effect, unfortunately.
All right, well, David Abbott, thank you for being with us today. The audience here is clapping. I know everybody out there in the virtual world is clapping as well. We really appreciate it. We look forward to your next presentation in the fall and to everything you're doing here as our distinguished jurists and residents. Thank you.